think that's everyone from the lobby so far. We might have a few people joining us as we go along, but I think we'll begin now. So welcome everyone to this VNI West webinar for the VNI, for those who may not know, the Victoria New South Wales Interconnector. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional lands that we're all calling in from and the country that this project covers, and where the VNI West is proposed to be delivered, and pay respects to elders past, present, the emerging leaders of traditional owner groups, and also respect the elders of any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups, particularly anyone who might be joining us today. We recognise the deep connection of First Nations people to country and their contribution to caring for, managing land, water, natural and built landscapes in the past, today and in the future, and acknowledge that those profound knowledge systems contribute so much to the work that we do across Australia. My name is Claire Flanagan-Smith, for those of you who I haven't met before, and I can see a few faces that are new to me there on the screen. I'm from RM Consulting Group. I'm an agricultural and environmental consultant, work across this part of the world and across Victoria generally. And I'm just going to be facilitating today. We've got a few things to talk about. I'm going to set the scene and then I'll be introducing our first speakers. But I do want to flag right up at the beginning that we've got a recording in progress today. So this recording will be published on TCV's website along with the presentation. There won't be any personal details made public, but I just want to flag that with you. So on that note, the recording records everything that you can see on your screen here now. And so just be aware of that. And if you feel comfortable, it would be really great if you can turn your video on, because it's good for us who are speaking to speak to actual faces on the screen. Audio has been disabled for the moment, but you'll see up the top or somewhere on your screen there's a Q&A button, and you can put a question in the chat to submit any questions that you might have today. We won't publish the Q&A session of this conversation. What will be up on the TCV website is the presentations by panelists, and this session, these slides that you can see in front of you will be seen, but there won't be any video images or other personal details of anyone published. So I just want to make that really clear. The format of today's session, we've got a bit over an hour and a half, or a bit under an hour and a half, I should say. It allows for quick 5-minute introductions from each of our presenters on key topics. And that's the idea of that, is to bring everyone up to speed and maybe to answer some questions that you've come here with, so that we can have a conversation and discussions and Q&A that come from a similar place. So we'll have a dedicated 10 minutes open Q&A after each presentation. So short listening periods, longer discussion. We really encourage you to get questions into the Q&A. We've had some questions from before the meeting, this webinar, so we'll be noting those questions, and some of those will be addressed in the Q&A, some of them will be addressed in the presentations themselves. And then at the end, we'll have a final open Q&A session to allow for any other questions that are more general in nature or that occur to you later on through the presentations and the webinar. The questions that go into the chat will be moderated by team members to make sure that the language is appropriate and make sure everyone has an equal opportunity to ask questions. This is really important. And there just will be a slight delay in questions being published and you hitting enter on your side of things. So just be aware of that. We will do our absolute best to make sure that every question raised in the Q&A session is addressed, as well as those ones that were submitted prior as part of the registration process. But we also have that undertaking that we will finish on time. So part of my job is to make sure that the questions are succinct, in their asking and succinctly answered as well, so that we can get through as many questions as possible. We will focus on questions that are within the scope or related to the VNI West project and/or related. We won't be able to answer questions around broader energy issues such as, say, nuclear energy or specific local renewable energy projects in great detail. We'll really, in the limited time that we have together, we'll be really focusing on the VNI West proposed development as well, in particular. So it's really important to try and hear as many questions as possible. So we will be dedicating the majority of the time to Q&A. Anything else that's not covered will be supplemented by the FAQ, the frequently asked questions that are on the website. So we'll make sure that those are up to date and updated with some of the questions that come through today as well. So to the agenda, we understand there are a wide range of interests, and through the registration process that became really clear. We can't cover everything in detail, but we will be focusing on 4 key topics that we think that the people who've registered today and the people who we've spoken to in the lead up to this webinar really want to talk about. So those 4 are the background of VNI West and why it's needed, the draft corridor and the process TCV underwent to get here. Thirdly, how landholder engagement is progressing and the process that TCV is following. And the 4th is the regulatory approval process that TCV have to undergo, including the environment effects statement. So that's the focus of our agenda. We've got presenters and a panel. So we're just going to go through to the slide with all the names of those people on there. So we've got Sam McGee, who is the project director for VNI West. Sam's got his hand up and the picture's up the top. Jeff Smith, you'll see there with his headphone on, is from ACOM and he is the Environment and Planning Director for this project. Mark Lampard, there in the white shirt, is the Technical Design Lead, waving. And Chris O'Halloran, I can't see you on my screen, Chris, but he's here. You might need to click across to the next one, is the Landholder and Engagement Lead. We'll also have panellists joining us. So we'll have Mitch Hume, who's the Stakeholder and Community Engagement Manager, Deepak Sharma, who's the Project Director for VicGrid, and George Warren, Agricultural Specialist, joining us for questions. So it's worth stopping here to take note. These are the people who you can ask questions of today during after each of their sessions and in the panel that we'll have at the end. So any questions you have that relate to the topics that these people cover are most welcome for today. So before each of those people present on their topic, they will introduce themselves in more detail so you've got a better understanding of who they are and where they come from. But now, without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Sam McGee from TCV, who's going to provide a quick background on the project for those of you who are less familiar with VNI West. And that will be a few slides from you, Sam, and then we'll come back to questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Claire. And thanks again, everyone, for attending today. We really appreciate you taking the time. If we can jump to the next slide, please. So look, I'll run through the background. The first slide here is about the need for new transmission. So I think everyone knows for the last many years, 60 plus years in Victoria, we've relied on brown coal out of the Latrobe Valley. So the coal fleet is retiring, and it's retiring relatively quickly. There's 3 major coal-fired power stations left in Victoria. The first one's going in 2028, it's the scheduled timeline, Yallourn. The next in 2035. So 60% of our coal fleet's going to retire in the next dozen years. In addition to that, there's contemplated doubling of electricity demand. So we've got a significant problem to ensure we keep the lights on through this transition phase. So how do we ensure we can supply that electricity demand? What do we do to fill the gap that coal's going to leave? and that is renewables. So that's solar, wind, and also storage. So that can be pumped hydro storage like Snowy 2.0, or batteries with gas as well to make up for gas generation, to make up for the gaps also. So in order to do that, we need a lot of storage, a lot of renewables, and a lot of gas-fired power stations over the next 10 years. In order to, but those renewables are not located at the same locations as the existing coal-fired power stations. So the coal-fired power stations are primarily located in the Latrobe Valley, down in Gippsland. And so a lot of our transmission runs down to the Latrobe Valley. The high voltage transmission runs to the Latrobe Valley to pick up the generation from those coal assets to bring it into places like your homes and throughout Victoria, where we all use the power. Now, with wind and solar, you need diverse locations for sources of supply. So you need wind in various locations. So with the wind's not blowing somewhere, it's blowing somewhere else. Sun's not shining somewhere, it's blowing somewhere else. So the diversity of supply is what's required. And then the locations include the Western Victoria. So we need to be able to access wind and solar resources in Western Victoria, as well as throughout the rest of the state. And to collect those resources to the rest of us, we need high voltage power supply, high voltage transmission. So that high voltage transmission includes VNI West. That's one of the 5 keys to the puzzle of how we solve this transition to renewables, the 5 key projects which are contemplated for this solution. If we could jump to the next slide, please. So as I spoke about, the energy system's changing. There's a few stats on this page which show the sort of changes that we're contemplating are required by 2050. So a huge increase in storage, huge increase in wind and solar, and total exit of coal by 2050. So for a state that's relied so much on brown coal for so many years for its reliability and stability of our supply, things are changing dramatically in the next 10 plus years, or the next 5 years plus when the next coal-fired power station exits. As I said, VNI West is one of 5 pieces of the puzzle to solve that transition from coal-fired power to renewables. We'll jump to the next slide, please. So VNI West in particular, it will connect Snowy 2.0 to Victoria, which gives us huge storage capacity. It also provides a second high voltage line to New South Wales. So currently there's one in the east. This will be the second one in the west. That diversity assists with our reliability and the stability of our system, and also the diversity of supply into Victoria assists with ensuring that we have just continuous supply continuity. So VNI West will be a big transmission line. It will carry enough generation, or harness enough generation to power approximately 2.3 million homes. So it's a very significant component of the transition to renewables and out of coal in Victoria. I'll jump to the next slide again, please. The timeline for VNI West. So this is just a very high level timeline. You can see I'm pointing at it, it's not useful for me to point at it. On the left-hand side of your screen, we undertook early planning, etc. in about 2019, it commenced. It was about 4 years of review of alternatives and options to determine what was the preferred sort of solution for this. There was a hell of a lot of work went into it. Ultimately, VNI West was selected. In May 2023, it was Area 5A that was chosen, which was the sort of pink blob that appeared on the maps that we distributed around May 2023. There was a corridor of about up to 50 kilometres wide. We've then narrowed that over the last 6 months to a corridor of, on average, about 2 kilometres, the draft corridor which we've referred to. And we spent the last 6 weeks before the 6 weeks before publication of that corridor, contact as many landholders as we could to inform them that they were in that corridor. We're now looking to go from this 2 kilometre corridor to mid next year, mid 2024. We'll narrow to an easement which is primarily about 70 metres wide, and that easement will narrow to that through discussions with landholders to work out how we can minimise impacts on farms and properties, and minimise impacts on the community as we have the discussions with community members. And we really encourage everyone to reach out to us and talk to us about impacts within their area, so we can really reduce that corridor from the 2Ks down to the 70 metre final easement with your assistance, really. getting input in relation to your known, the issues that affect your area and your businesses and what have you. We'll also be going through the EES process from here, which is out to about end of 2025. We're hoping to have project approvals and construction starting in 26, with project completion and the line energised in by 2030. So that's the timeline. Thanks very much, Claire. That's presentation complete for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. We'll be coming to questions after the next presentation. So the next presentation is about the draft corridor and corridor refinement process. Mark, you're all set to go. Mark Lampard will introduce himself.
Thanks, Claire. So Mark Lampard's my name. I'm a technical lead for the project from AECOM. And I've been involved in the industry for around about 30 years, and I've recently been doing this sort of early stage work for projects like Central West Arana Res in New South Wales. So as Sam noted, there's been a lot of work already done here, and getting to that area of interest. And once we got to the area of interest, we looked at a constraints mapping process, which we released to the public back in July. And throughout the process, I guess our priority has been look for a draft corridor with the least impact. And you'll note on this slide that there is still more steps to go. And as noted by Sam, we're really looking for input and support in taking that through to those next steps, because the more input we get now, the better solution we'll get. So we're narrowing down the corridor and really understanding possible line alternatives. We need your help. The 2 kilometre on average corridor is a starting point, but for the majority, we're only going to need to get down to around about the 70 metres. So in the coming months, we'll be working closely with communities and landholders across the area to find the best location for that 70 metre easement. So in developing the next corridor on the next slide, we've tried to use the principle of avoidance with respect to sensitive environmental and social values. That doesn't mean we've been able to avoid them all, but we've been looking to reduce and limit the impact. So we've had specialists in the relevant environmental and technical fields undertaking an analysis and trying to look at the key factors and local considerations to get the draft corridor down and one that we have with the least impact. So that's included around 17 specialists in areas such as ecology, flooding, landscape impact, visual, agriculture, cultural heritage, all of those things coming together. But we do note that at this time, this is a desktop analysis and a desktop analysis only, and we need to we now need to get out into the field and have more looking at things and working on that corridor as we go. But as well as this technical analysis, on the next slide, you can see, we've really benefited from a large number of engagement with a large number of groups, and those are identified on this slide here. And community impact input has been really critical to understanding constraints and trying to find areas where we need to avoid with respect to sensitivity. And people have been really generous with sharing details about their farm and their farming practices, the ecosystems on their properties, the animals they find, and the unique landmarks. And we really do want to thank everyone for that input to date, and certainly we're looking to get more of that as we move forward. And the interactive map that was sort of utilised through the last process was visited more than 4,000 times by over 200 people, and over 2,300 separate different comments were provided on that. So how do we bring this all together? Well, the next slide shows the feedback, the sorts of things of feedback that we received, and they really come down to 4 key areas: the land use and agriculture, the culture and heritage, environment, and then infrastructure. And there's some of the sorts of things that people provided to us sitting here. And there was a number of areas that we had to look at and either broaden or shrink to try and make sure we got into all these areas. So All of this was brought together in the draft corridor. So if we move on to our next slides, what we've tried to do is look at this draft corridor, and one of the things here you'll see on the left of this screen is the draft corridor showing it within our constraints map as it was provided back in July, while the right-hand one is showing more of a clear path to where it is. In developing, through the process of the consultations and technical analysis that I talked about earlier, the areas further west and north of the area of interest were most certainly seen as the areas that displayed the least constraints relative to other possible areas through the east or the centre of this corridor, the area of interest, sorry. So in developing the draft corridor, we have aimed to try and get it down to a 2 kilometre width. However, that hasn't been possible in all areas. You'll notice there's some areas that have broadened where there's need to have a look at options throughout that, and down some quite small areas where the constraints have been such that we really haven't had a lot of room to be able to work our way through. So areas specifically in the southern area, you'll see that there's a duplication or widening of that area to try and help with the connection into the existing network. And in the northern area around the Murray River, it's quite broad to try and, or to help us to set that up with Transgrid, who released this same report on the same day as we released this one. But it should be noted that it's not possible to avoid all the areas of interest, and we need to make sure that if we are where we are going across areas, it's not that we'll move the corridor, we'll have to find engineering solutions, or we'll be assessing impacts in those areas to try and show what we do in that area. So it has been quite difficult to work through that, but we have tried to avoid areas and where there are still areas of constraint and things that we find when we are out in the field. We'll need to look at those and look for solutions and different route options. As I said, we're only looking at a 70-metre corridor. So the sorts of things that we've had to avoid are locations with high levels of on-farm infrastructure, which tend to be incompatible with transmission lines. We've sought to maximise distance between transmission infrastructure and townships or individual rural residences. A question I get asked a lot is what does that mean? And the aim is to look at a 300 metre clearance, and we'll continue to look at that as we go through the process. We've certainly avoided areas throughout the corridor containing bull oak trees and box trees. There's a lot of endangered orchids, but also a lot of specific species in the area that people have talked to us about. An example of wedge-tailed eagles, where they've been sighted has certainly been in there. And we've also had to look at, reviewed the existing and potential renewable energy developments where VNI West provides opportunities for connection points, and that's particularly relevant around the Kerrang area. And that's the end of my presentation, I believe, Claire, so it's back to you.
Thank you, Mark. And I think we're up to a Q&A for both Sam and Mark on their presentations, but I would just like to note in response to Vic Johnson's comment in the Q&A, we're happy to have the whole of the Q&A released, so the recording included in the recording that is published. So that's a change in response to that comment there. So please do feel free to turn your camera off if you're not happy with that, or to send your questions through the chat if you would rather not speak them to the group. Okay, so questions from the floor. Putting your hand up won't work because we can't actually hear from people on the webinar, so please do put your comments, your questions through the Q&A. If you're having trouble with the Q&A, there is also, as the chat says, an email address that you can get, inquiries@transmissionvictoria.com.au. That's inquiries with an E at transmissionvictoria.com.au. Or you can call on the hotline 1800 824-221. Okay, so first question. I'm going to go from the bottom to the top. So Keith had a question there. The current VNI West is based on very poor foundations with misleading information, pursued by highly vested interest. It's not the cheapest or best option. And note that the corridor is now 11% longer than the original proposed 5A. That's option 5A. Why do you think there are so many people opposed to this TCV AMO project? Sam, I'm going to pass that one to you. Make sure you unmute.
You can hear me? Thumbs up?
Yes, thanks.
Perfect. Look, I think it's a big change. There's a huge change that we're all experiencing with the exit of coal. So as I spoke about before, we need to we are transitioning away from coal. That's happening. So with that, we need new sources of power. And new sources of power include solar and wind. To harness those sources of solar and wind, we need transmission. It is a change for the community. They haven't had major project like this, I believe, come through for a long time. And there's also been, to be fair, a little bit of misinformation in relation to the implications of transmission in relation to the regions where they pass through. So I think that's been challenging for a lot of people. Also, I think there's been proposals of alternatives, which like nuclear and things like that, which are sold as something which is a golden solution. But to be fair, things like nuclear, we actually have legislative bans on nuclear in Victoria and throughout Australia, which means we can't implement a nuclear solution. And nuclear also takes a very long time. It would take 20 years to build a substantive nuclear power station. So I think it's change, and there's, with change and uncertainty comes apprehension as well. So it is a challenging project. It's challenging for everyone, but yeah.
Thanks, Sam. Question from Barry. Now, back end, just bear with me for a second. We're actually able to, if people want to, they can speak their question to the group rather than me reading it out. Is that right? I'm asking Marinor.
Yes,
up?
if you just prompt me who to unmute, I'll give them the option to be able to unmute.
Barry, if you put your hand up, we'll be able to take your question. Great. And you just, Barry, there in the hat, sitting outside. You're still muted. I'll let you know when you're off. You now need to unmute yourself. It's a double unmute process. See if I can ask you to unmute. I can't. Sorry, Barry, it's not working. You need to hit the little microphone button until it doesn't have a cross through it.
It should work now.
All right. We might come back to Barry just once perhaps Marinor, if you can let me know when Barry's mute is unsorted, but never fear, Barry, we'll come back to you. Other questions in the chat? There's another one from Keith. Keith, are you there? And would you like to address the group? If you are, if you can put your hand up, that helps us. No joy. And Barry doesn't seem to have had any luck. Sorry, Barry, I'm going to read out your question just in the interest of continuing on, if that's all right. Thank you. So your question just says, on the 23rd of May 2021, Dr. Anne Webster spoke in the Federation Chamber regarding VNI West. I think those dates might be a little out, but this is a huge win for the Mallee, as it will allow the solar energy sector in the north of the electorate to flourish and expand. So the question, Dr. Webster now opposes VNI West being built as option 5. Has she asked TCV for alternative transmission line routes to be found to enable the flourishing and expansion she wants to see in the north of the electorate?
I can answer, not that I'm aware of, but I don't know whether she's raised it with others. Mitch, you pass to Mitch.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So I think, Barry, the dates that you've mentioned are around when VNI West was proposed in previous editions of AEMO's integrated system plan. Got a thumbs up from you there. So thanks for the confirmation. And really the answer to those is in the way that VNI West removes constraints on the existing network by connecting to an existing line which runs to the south of Kerrang within the project area. So by having that connection into the existing network, it helps to free up some of the generation constraints that exist in the north of the state. But there might be some additional I suppose, opportunities that come out of any future renewable energy zone development process that might occur around the area as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Mitch. Lisa, we're going to come to you after the next question. So if you can just get ready, I can see that your hand is up. So we'll come to a question from you. If in the back end of things, we can organise that. But I will just say there's a question from Mark that came in before from Brian. Why aren't the transmission lines being placed underground?
Thanks, Claire. It's a great question. And the answer is the first question everybody hears, or the first answer everybody hears about that is cost. You know, the work that's been done and the studies that have been done to date talk about a 5 to 10 times increase in cost, but it's not all about cost. The undergrounding actually is an issue for a number of things. With the sorts of undergrounding we're talking here, you actually have to open trench the undergrounding process. So you actually end up with quite a wide and deep trench across the land, quite a bit deeper than a lot of the gas lines people have seen in previous issues, and that does provide, does give a lot of impact on the environment. So there is a lot of environmental impact caused by open trenching and undergrounding. There are spots where we will be able to use directional boring and directional drilling, and that is part of the solution for some of that, but it's also quite an expensive thing to do. The other thing is that, wherever you have a joint in a cable, you also have to have a big concrete pit. So it's not that we totally remove the impact on land, because you end up with some quite big concrete pits through the landscape as well, instead of towers. I know there's a difference there. And the last one is that you still have an easement, you still have constraints on what you can do above that easement. So it's not quite the direct easy answer that we would love it to be. And it's also, there's a lot of conversations about different types of undergrounding that we could talk about around alternating current versus direct current, but they still have similar concerns and issues, just the costs are different.
Thanks, Mark. We've got time for one more question before we go to the next presentation. Hold on to your questions, keep putting them in the chat. We'll get to them in the Q&A session at the end, or as many as we possibly can. But Lisa, over to you. Yep.
I was originally mainly just going to comment that I'm having technical problems on the slide, not getting chat, not getting Q&A. But what's been just said there, there's a few important things when it comes to misinformation. It would be good to get into a little bit deeper, and I think from the agricultural perspective, I think there's also been some misinformation or misunderstanding about types of impacts, or even what we're talking about in underground, because when we talk about
Lisa,
we're also talking.
Lisa, we're only catching about every third word there. So what I might ask you to do is send that through as a message, if you don't mind, because we really can't hear your comments, unfortunately.
Lisa, it's echoing. If you put your headset on, it might work.
Yeah, but we really can't hear the question.
I'll put a comment in, because that's what's working.
Oh, that's
me.
right. You can't do that. There's
Like leaving and coming in again, I have tried texting signals.
Lisa, send me a text.
you can send Sam a text. The other thing I would say, Lisa, she's gone. But for anyone else who's having the same problem, if you're on an iPad or an iPhone or a smartphone, you'll have to swipe your screen across to get to the slides or the chat. That's part of the way the app works. Okay, we'll see if we can connect with Lisa again in a moment. So we're going to go on to the next presentation. As I said, hold on to your questions, keep getting them into the Q&A. The next presentation is about working with landholders, and we're going to hear from Chris O'Halloran about that. Chris, are you there and ready? Great, thanks.
Yep, can you hear me? Yep. So I'm Chris O'Halloran, land lead for TCV. So on 21st of August, we started to reach out to landholders prior to the release of the draft corridor. Each landholder is allocated a land liaison officer. The landholder liaisons attempted to contact people by using publicly available information. So this includes title searches, phone books, Google searches, that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, we weren't able to speak to everyone prior to the release of the corridor. So, you know, following those searches, trying to cold call and meet up with people. We still had quite a few people to reach out to, so we sent information packs with contact details, encouraging people to reach out to us, and we're still at the stage, you know, reaching out to people that we may not have spoken to as yet, but the attempt was to try and reach as many people as we could prior to the release of that corridor. There's around about sort of 540 properties in that 2K corridor, so it's quite a task to reach out to everyone, but obviously doing everything we can. But I think the key thing to remember is that this contact was about reaching out to people, providing a contact. It's the start of engagement. It's not the end of the engagement process. There's just one thing to take on board. So one of the key things that we're trying to talk to people about is find out about how landholders use their land. You know, what are the specific interests on it that we need to know about, because that information is really key about. So Mark and Sam were talking about that refinement process from the 2K down to the 70 meters. So all that information is really key in working ways in the design process so we can mitigate those issues and address some of those key things that will form part of the environmental and approvals process, which Jeff will talk to about next. So in saying that, as the engagement process continues, we'll need to start talking to landholders in the corridor about negotiating access for surveys. For the rest of the 2023 period, the amount of private properties we'll need access to is quite a small amount. It's sort of 10 to 15% of that sort of 540 number we talked about. And the reason for this is in that initial period of time, a lot of the survey work, because it's ecological, can be done on public land such as road and waterways. But again, I'll let Jeff go into that part of it a bit more. However, as we sort of move into 2024, we'll need to negotiate access for a large number of properties as the types of surveys that need to be done change a little bit. So, as I say, it's intended to be a negotiated process. The idea is to reach an agreement into what we call a land access agreement. One of the key things as part of that agreement, and part of those negotiations to get access, if someone's willing to give that access, is really document key requirements for landholders. So that's, you know, where a property can be accessed, how you leave fences, biosecurity requirements, timeframes, you know, don't come on the property when I'm harvesting, all that kind of stuff. So that those key things to make sure that we minimise the impact during that process as much as possible. And it's just important to note with the access side of it, the access agreement and the surveys, it's not doesn't allow us to construct any transmission infrastructure. It's about undertaking survey work to feed into the environmental approval process. It's not about constructing an actual line itself. But if after the refinement process is complete, so we've gone down the 2K to the 70-meter corridor, then we'll look to talk to people about, talk to those landholders who are impacted about negotiating an option for easement agreement. The option for easement agreement will look to cover a few things, but one of the important things is the compensation elements. So I think there's a lot of sort of rhetoric out there about the big government announced 8,000 per linear kilometre for 25 years payment. That's an element of compensation the Victorian government has announced, but it's not the whole lot. So compensation is actually a mix of a few things. So if we're able to negotiate an easement through an option agreement, there's a payment for an option fee. There's an assessment of the impact of an easement on the property that follows principles of the Land Acquisition and Compensation Act, Valuation of Land Access. So the key things out of those, though, are it'll look at what someone's land is, how it's used, impacted business, all that kind of stuff to come up with a figure that'll be assessed by relevant experts such as a valuer, agronomist, that kind of stuff. So it's capturing those impacts as a result of that easement. One of the other elements in there to consider is that we cover those reasonable legal valuation, professional fees of the landholder. So if someone's not comfortable with the valuation that our valuer assesses, they can get their own, and the two valuers meet to come to a consensus on the valuation. Just sort of highlight, I think we had sort of a couple of questions come through prior to the actual webinar today, just in relation to things like the application of tax, that kind of stuff on payments, that kind of stuff. So one of the things about tax, it really depends on the personal circumstances. Like a valuation is very dependent on the land and land use. Tax is very dependent on the individual, the ownership, is it a company, is it a trust, all that kind of stuff. So we can't advise on those kind of things. However, as I was saying, those professional fees are covered as part of, reasonable professional fees are covered as part of that compensation process. So you're able to get advice to determine the impacts, those tax implications on those payments you'll get, and able to make a decision on that basis. So again, I highlight, we've also got the landholder guide out there. This talks about that process in more detail, but I'd also encourage, if any questions, a bit more detail about compensation, we have the landholder liaisons out there. They can feed any questions back to us. They can sort of walk through what some of those processes look like, when it comes that time to talk about compensation in a little bit more detail. But, compensation, as I say, really needs to take on board, what the easement is, the conditions of the easement, what the infrastructure is, and the impact on the specific farm itself. And Claire, that's the end of the presentation for me.
Thanks, Chris. So we've got some pre-submitted questions that I'm going to throw to Chris, but we're also welcoming questions in the Q&A. So the first one was from Roger. So Roger asked if someone could confirm on the online portal the taxation ramifications. So I think you've just dealt with that one.
I think there's a couple around the tax item, but I think he was asking a little bit about bit more detail about the $8,000 the government announced payment, and I think we've got Deepak potentially on the line to go in a bit more detail that, because it's a VGrid policy rather than a TCV one that we'll implement.
Yeah. So we'll go to Deepak in the later panel. There was another one from Kate about the amount of compensation going to landholders.
Yep.
So that was covered as well. Is there anything else to cover on that one, Chris?
No, I think it's just to reiterate that it's each property is very unique. You've got to go through a process to look at. So the valuation needs to consider the loss in land value, but also the impacts to the business. You may need agronomists, that kind of stuff. So I think Kate's question was sort of around impact to crops, that kind of stuff. So that's part of the consideration that we need to be taken to that process. And as we say, as sort of said earlier, the important thing to point out is that landholders are able to get their own advice, and we pay for the reasonable cost of that advice as well. And that's something I'd encourage them to go and do to make sure they feel that they've got the appropriate compensation as part of that process.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. While other questions come in for Chris, Sam, you managed to catch Lisa offline, who had the question from the last session?
Lisa hasn't, she's got some computer system change today, so she's actually not on still, but she will probably watch the recording later on. So I'll just run through Lisa's comments. First one was in response to what I said earlier about people's apprehension about the line. I said misinformation, and she said, Sam, misunderstanding is a much better way of putting it, and I think she's absolutely right. I should have said misunderstanding rather than misinformation. That's a fair call. So that was not what I should have said. And she's raised a question or comment, undergrounding. We say that existing transport alignments, we say down existing transport alignments. The answer was overhead has massive impacts on soil that cannot be rehabilitated. So impacts on soil through relative impacts on soil, I suppose, through undergrounding or overheading. Mark or Jeff, is that something you can speak to?
So I'll start that one, and we might throw to George as well on some of that and what his experience is. But what I was trying to say was around when we go quite deep, you actually it changes the top layers and stuff, or tends to, and it takes some time to rehabilitate and get things back running. It is possible, but it just takes time to do that. And I think, George, you had some specific points on that last time I talked to you about it. Where is he?
Yes, and I think every farm will be different. And I just think it's important that people are given the opportunity to explain their case, explain why during the construction period they feel it will alter their farm business, disrupt their farm business, and how that will occur. And in the longer term, certainly for overhead power lines, my understanding the impact on grazing systems is minimal. The impact on cropping systems may occur as a result of some of the limitations that have been applied on the use of drones, the use of aerial agriculture in the easement. And earlier there was a concern about burning under the power lines when you're trying to get rid of heavy stubble trash, and that's been modified to enable burning with approval, subject to obviously an assessment of the heat load. So we do need to understand the impact on each farm business, and to do that, I think there are some resources available to equip landholders to explain that case really clearly, and that'll be an important part of the assessment. And obviously, it's very difficult for people now standing back and wondering just where the power line's going to go to try and understand what those impacts will be. But as everyone said, the more we can communicate with each other, the more we can go through the first stage, which is trying to minimise the impact of the route that is chosen. So thanks for that.
Thanks, George. We do have time, actually, Deepak, to throw to you for your response to the questions about the 8,000 per kilometre payment for 25 years. There's been a couple of questions along those lines. Are you there, Deepak?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Deepak Sharma. I'm Director of Project Delivery at VigGrid. So we are part of the Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action within the government. So there were two questions with regards to the landholder payment. The first question was, is this subject to CPI adjustments? And the answer to that is yes, the payments are indexed, and the information is online on EnergyVic website. So I'll work with the AMO team to make sure that that link is available for everyone to refer to. The second question that I had was, is the a normal taxable, or is it exempt from tax, or is it taxable? So payments are likely to be taxable depending on a person or entity's tax status. VigGrid is working with ATO, so we have reached out to the Australian Taxation Office, and we will provide a fact sheet on this matter shortly that AMO or TCB will publish as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Deepak. So I think we will, again, hold questions on landholder engagement if you have any others until the end of the panel at the end of this webinar. So now I'm going to introduce Jeff Smith, who's going to talk about the environment effects statement process. Jeff, over to you.
Thank you, Claire, and yes, good afternoon, everybody. I'll just reintroduce myself, Jeff Smith from AECOM. We're an independent engineering and environmental consultancy, and my role will be to assist with developing and progressing the environment effects statement for the project, assuming one is needed, which I think it will be. So just quickly, I'm going to touch on that process going forward, and particularly just highlight a couple of areas where the community in particular can input to the process. It is a robust and transparent process, and it does allow the community to be actively involved all the way through. And that's not just landholders who are affected, but the broader community. I just emphasise too that the release of the corridor several weeks ago by TCV is not a project approval. So there has been some questioning around, does that mean the release of the corridor means the project's approved? The answer is no. The project is going to need both state government and Commonwealth government approval under environmental legislation. And certainly the definition of environment in both of those processes is very broad. So it's not just ecology, it covers off something like 20 areas of some of the ones you've heard about today already around safety, social impact, much broader, impacts on agriculture, etc. So it's a very broad, all-encompassing study. So the steps that are involved in the process, the next step will be that TCV will make what's known as a referral to both the Commonwealth and state ministers, asking both ministers to provide guidance on what level of environmental assessment is required for the project. And the ministers will consider that and will provide advice back to TCV. And certainly my experience in the industry over a lot of years would suggest that almost certainly it will require an environment effects statement under the state legislation and consideration of Commonwealth approvals under the environment legislation at the Commonwealth level. The next step in the process is where the Minister makes that decision and then will provide TCV with what are called scoping requirements or study requirements for the project. So they will be detailed requirements of the Minister in terms of all of the studies that are needed for the EES, what level of depth each of those studies needs to cover, the key issues that need to be covered, and all of those sort of things that you might have seen in other EESs if you've been involved in some of the renewables projects. But the scoping document, and this is important for folk on the call, that the scoping requirements are publicly advertised. So the Minister advertises those widely and seeks inputs from stakeholders on whether they're adequate, whether they've missed issues of concern, whether there are things that landholders and stakeholders in the wider community feel need more attention or have not been addressed at all. So I would have, suggest that you take advantage of that advertising because it is an opportunity to make sure that all of the things that you as community or landholders feel need attention in the ES, that's your opportunity to ensure that they get into the documentation. So once the Minister receives those submissions, the guidelines are firmed up and they're provided to TCV, and that forms the basis of the EES. The next step of the EES process is basically preparing the EES, and that's a process that takes quite some time because it involves a lot of technical studies, a lot of field work, a lot of engagement with landholders looking at sort of where the infrastructure might be, and then so there's a baseline data collection phase where a lot of the ecology and cultural heritage and all of those sort of baseline environmental conditions are identified, documented, and that forms the basis for then looking at what does the infrastructure or how does the infrastructure impact on those environmental values in the corridor. And then the final step in that is looking at working with landholders to minimise impacts by micro-siting towers and other infrastructure and looking at other mitigations that can be put in place. So that's how the EES process progresses, and there'll be a lot of engagement with community right through that process. And then the final stage of the process is what I guess we could loosely deem to be the review process for the EES. So all the way through the EES, the government sets up what's called a technical reference group, which DTP, Department of Transport and Planning, administer. And that has representatives of all of the agencies that are relevant to this, and they review all of the studies, they review all of the chapters of the EES, and provide guidance to TCV so that by the time the EES is finalised and ready for exhibition, it's been through some very rigorous technical review by all of the relevant government agencies. DTP then do a final review of that EES and it's placed on public exhibition, typically for a period of 6 weeks effectively. And that process is where you can make submissions to the Minister on any aspect of the EES or anything that has been missed in your view in the EES or areas that you think need more attention in the EES. Anything you'd like to submit on can be then lodged over that 6-week period. The Minister then will set up what's called an independent inquiry or an independent panel inquiry, which is a group of specialist experts in the fields that are most relevant to the project. They're drawn from a pool of independent people on the Panels Victoria database. So they're experts who are independent of TCV, independent of government, and their role is to establish a panel inquiry to hear submissions on the project. So all of you that choose to make submissions and wish to be heard can go and present to that inquiry. You don't have to present, but your submission would still be considered whether you present or not. The panel then makes some recommendations and a report to the Minister on the adequacy of the EES and recommendations around how the project should either proceed or not proceed based on submissions and things that have been received. And the final step in all of that is that the Minister will then make a decision, an assessment of the project, and will advise decision makers on whether the project should proceed with a lot of conditions or not proceed. And sometimes there is a bit of scepticism about projects always get approved. Well, I can assure you that that's not the case. There have been recent environment effect statements where the Minister has deemed that the impacts associated with that project have been unacceptable and has either required a supplementary statement to be conducted or has rejected a proposal outright. So this process of engagement and working with stakeholders in the community to ensure that those inputs are received does have influence on whether we can get to an acceptable set of environmental conditions that would allow the project to proceed. So Claire, I might just leave it at that. I think, oh, sorry, there is one other slide there just showing you and I won't go through them, but if you can see them on the screen, you'll see the extent of the sort of studies that are undertaken as part of an EES. They're all very broad, very all-encompassing, and you'll notice some of the hot topics around fire risk and so on that have been topical in recent times are all covered in there: flooding, cultural heritage, ecology, etc., agriculture. So I won't dwell on that, but only to say that it's a very comprehensive set of studies. And I think that's where I'd leave it, Claire. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff.
I'll beg your pardon. I have forgotten one last slide that I've been reminded of on the screen, and it is an important one. This is about ecology survey. So a lot of you here would realise that the spring-summer period is fairly important for ecological surveys because it's obviously the time when lots of things are blooming and blossoming and growing and emerging, etc. So in the coming months through spring, summer, there will be ecologists out in the field working on surveys, looking at the remnant vegetation, the habitats and so on that we can gain access to at this point, those on freehold land where we've been granted access, and particularly along road reserves and river reserves and things where we can start the survey process. And then those surveys will flow into next year's spring, summer period as well to allow us to get better access. And I would also point out that the surveys are non-invasive. They're just basically ecology surveys that don't involve any land disturbance or any other sort of invasive practices. And for those landholders on the call where you do have, and I know there's a lot of questions coming through on ecology and remnant vegetation, we would urge you to grant access to the ecologists doing this work so that those values can be properly documented and done so that protection of them can be built into the EES.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks to Mark and Tegan for your pre-submitted questions that Jeff has attempted to answer in that presentation. If there's any follow-up question you have, please do put that in the Q&A. We have a question. The first one here is from Kate with C. about now that you've pinpointed the exact route, why haven't you opened up the opportunity for people to submit letters of opposition? And just a question really about, we know that the current route was in the original corridor, but it was clear that the option was for the east of Charlton originally, not for the west. So, Jeff, would you mind talking about just the process for opposition to the route?
Yeah, look, I might also get Mitch or Sam to answer. I think the question about the earlier options around option 3 and 5 and so on is an evolution of the project, which is probably a TCV question to answer. But in terms of able to, now that the corridor's published, being able to make submissions, and the EES process is open to receiving submissions at any time. And I know TCV are also open to receiving inputs at any time around issues related to the corridor, and would welcome them, in fact, because it gives us more and more information to work with. So what I outlined in the formal process is where the EES allows you to engage formally at different times, but throughout the EES process, the sort of community sessions and sessions that we've been holding in the regions, in the town halls and so on, will still be progressing. So there's ample opportunity for those sort of submissions to be received formally and informally at any point.
Thanks, Jeff. We have another question from Anne Hughes. What plan does VNI have for protecting both the habitat and lives of these birds, given habitat loss is the major threat to our birds, and for the Brolga power lines are deadly?
Yeah, look, I'll take that one as well. The short answer is, again, the baseline work we've done to date and the desktop work that we've done to date is focused very strongly on identifying all of the habitats and remnant vegetation from all of the government databases. Aerial imagery now is extremely powerful and allows an ability to look at habitats and, in fact, almost potentially identify all the vegetation types in those habitats without accessing the land. But as I said earlier, our preference would be to be able to survey those areas. So one of the big areas of avoidance that the project is focusing on is avoiding vegetation wherever possible. And with a linear project, it is possible to microsite tower locations and things, avoiding remnant vegetation. There are clearly areas like river and road crossings where we've looked at potential alignments where it could be possible to cross at points where vegetation is either not present or is sort of understory that can be covered without or crossed without needing any vegetation clearance. So it's a very large priority to avoid vegetation and habitats. In relation to the wetlands and the Brolgas, again, the constraints mapping does identify Brolga habitats, and there's quite a complex process for surveying Brolga habitats, which I won't dwell on, but there are sort of guidelines released by DECA for a 900 metre buffer around breeding habitats for Brolgas, and that relates more to wind turbines than it does to power lines. And I think wind turbines are generally considered a bigger threat to birds that migrate across the landscape than transmission lines. But again, we're working closely to try and work within all of those buffers to avoid those sort of, Brolga migration and breeding areas and the like.
Thanks, Jeff. A question from Christine. Does your assessment of the corridor also take into account the vegetation along routes / passages across land?
Claire, conscious we missed part of the previous question about the transition from 3 to 5 to 5A. Was part of the question.
Yeah, that's right. So Mitch was going to cover that aspect from Kate's question. So Christine, we'll come back to your question next.
Sorry.
Mitch,
so sorry, Claire, could we just, we going on with the vegetation, or is Mitch jumping in?
No, just hang on for the vegetation. I just want to make sure we've got Kate's question answered.
Yeah, thanks. So, Kate, the question around why the route moved was outlined in a document that was released earlier this year called the Project Assessment Conclusions Report. Effectively, through an analysis of the options that were available to join one part of the electricity system with another part, there's a whole bunch of geography things in between that that are different. So within the option areas that we called option 5 and 5A, TCB undertook an analysis which we called a multi-criteria analysis, where we tried to consider a whole range of issues that you normally wouldn't be able to consider as part of what is really a very purely economic test called the RIT-T, or the Regulatory Investment Test for Transmission. That allowed us to look at more issues related to things like land use, things like social constraints, environmental constraints, which otherwise you kind of just have to ignore. And in this case, we think that it actually allowed us to come up with an option that better represented the real world between the connection points. So the work that's been going on since the release of that corridor really has been to identify an appropriate route within that option 5A corridor. And I think, as Mark sort of alluded to in the constraints mapping process, having gone through that exercise, it emerged to us that the option that made the most sense in that part of the world is the one that we've now released as part of the draft corridor. So I hope that helps to answer that question.
Thanks, Mitch. We are going to hold there. Christine, I'm holding your question to be the first in the panel. So we'll, Jeff, you're on notice too for that question about vegetation. But it's time now to invite Sam back to talk about next steps, and before we have our final longer Q&A session. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you. Sorry, just confusingly trying to come off mute, but I worked it out. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. The next steps, look, it's really, I mean, the important thing here is we're moving from the 2 kilometre draft corridor to a 70 metre, predominantly 70 metre easement over the next 9 months or so, or up until about mid next year. So to do that, we really want input from the community and input from people within the draft corridor to help us design a line that design a final 70 metre corridor that minimises the impacts on you. By getting that input from you, we can, we get your insights. We can help work with you to ensure that those, we best respect those issues that affect you as a farmer, landholder, whatever interest you have in the land. It means we're not making assumptions in relation to the impacts on your land. We've actually got your input, and we can really take that quality information to ensure we refine the route properly down to 70 metres. So that's the real objective the next 6 months or so, till mid next year. We also will be going through the process of field surveys, preliminary field surveys, to contribute to the EES. So they will be as going through looking for information like Jeff described earlier, habitats, cultural surveys, etc., to try and determine also constraints within the 2 kilometre corridor to help us narrow to the 70 metre corridor. That will then we'll develop an environmental effects statement, which will be referred to the minister at some point, or we do expect strongly we'll be going down an environmental effects statement path. So yeah, really look forward to your contributions over the next period of time to help us refine that corridor. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thanks, Sam. So we've now got the remaining 20 minutes for panel Q&A. I'm going to invite all of the people who will be part of that panel to make sure that their cameras are on and that they're ready to talk. So we'll be bringing, we've got Deepak, you've seen, Mitch, Sam, Mark, Jeff, George and Chris will all be here to answer any questions that you have. Keep them coming through, but we do have a bit of a list here. I will say at this point, I think it's unlikely we'll get through all of the questions, but I want to reiterate that we will make sure that any outstanding questions are addressed in the materials on the website, including adding new questions to the FAQ document. So let's go. The first one, as we promised, Jeff is going to answer Christine's question about whether the assessment of the corridor will also take into account the vegetation along routes, passages along land for vehicle access, and the transportation of construction materials. Over to you, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. And I think the answer to that is not dissimilar to what I sort of mentioned at the last comment, is that the whole principle of what we're trying to achieve in moving into a design and the 70-metre corridor and things like laydown areas and access tracks, etc., is avoidance of clearance. So we're starting at the principle of trying to avoid any vegetation clearance. Certainly not saying that's going to be 100% achievable, but it is the absolute starting point. So any of those infrastructure elements during construction, particularly, but also in operation and just in fact in siting the final 70-metre alignment, we'll be very conscious of avoiding all the things Mark described earlier, not just ecology values, but far away from houses as possible. There's significant cultural heritage sites throughout the region, etc. So we are trying to navigate a 70-metre alignment through all of those values using the avoidance principle as a starting point.
Thank you, Jeff. Sam or Chris, we've got a question from Vicky about whether TCV have applied to the ESC for a transmission licence yet, and if not, or a licence is not granted, what will happen regarding access to people's properties if you don't get landholder permission?
Sure. We have not applied yet. We're hoping to submit our application in the next few days. The application process takes 12 or so weeks, plus or minus a few weeks. We hope to receive approval. And until we have a license, there's landholders don't have to agree to us coming onto the land. Once we have a license, they don't have to either. It's up to them. It's with a license that you gain a power of compulsory access, but there is a process to go through for that. So, yeah, that's simple as it is.
Great. Thank you, Sam. The next question I'd like to go to is from, let's go to Jared, who is responsible for assessing alternative project options to ensure the ongoing validity of the option 5A business case. That's another one for you, Jeff, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I won't comment on the business case because that's not my area of expertise, and that might be someone else to answer that. But in terms of the, I think if I understood the question, that it keeps assessing the viability of options, and as the project progresses down to that 70 metres, if that's what I understand the question to be, the process of the EES is going to be very much driven by this technical reference group, which I described earlier, which are the government agencies, and the process will involve working with landholders and so on to identify the best options for navigating through the corridor in terms of minimising impact on all the values we've talked about, getting guidance from property owners and things around where they'd like to see the infrastructure if they have to have it on their property, and then getting guidance from the government agencies and things on the technical merits of the options that are being considered within the corridor. So there'll be a lot of scrutiny, a lot of discipline and a lot of rigour in getting that reference design down to a best possible option within the corridor that minimises impacts. So I'm not sure if that answered the question, but that's the way the process will work anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. George, there's a question here from Wendy. Considering Australia has less than around 4% arable agricultural land, and this route is basically within that, where are the risk assessments for this project in consideration of this?
Well, I understand the comprehensive risk assessment will be part of the environmental effects statement, but if the question is regarding the line of interest that we've now developed, the 2 kilometre band, the roughly 2 kilometre band through, it's an assessment that's been done by the panel looking at all the factors that Jeff was talking about earlier, and the agricultural impacts are real and they're obviously very significant for the families and the people involved. But we've tried to choose the path that has the least impact on agriculture, keeping in mind all of those other constraints. And that's not to say there's no impact, and it's not to say there's not some brilliant farming operations in the middle of this power line, but we really have to work with those farmers, as has been said a number of times now, to try and find the path that has the least impact, given the broad route that we've chosen.
Thanks, George. Kate has a question that Sam will throw to you about statements to the media that 50% of landholders are in favour or neutral of this route, noting that where she lives, there are none in favour or neutral.
Yeah, Kate, that's of the landholders we've spoken to. So when I made that statement, we'd spoken to 40% of landholders in the corridor, the draft 2 kilometre corridor, and more than 50% of those were neutral or positive. The sentiment, was neutral or positive. I can't remember if I noted that on the radio or not, but that is something that I will note in future, because this has been confusing and annoying for people who've thought he's got to be kidding. There's not more than 50% people favourable for this thing. So we've managed to reach out to about 40% of the route at the time that I said that, and it was majority were positive or neutral in sentiment. So, but it's annoyed a few people, that statement, so I probably just won't say it in future.
I think I might just add to that, Kate, we're not under any illusion about the fact that there is a lot of concern in the community about the impact that this project might have, and there are a lot of people who have expressed to us some pretty strong opposition and some pretty serious concerns about what the impact might be, not just on their farms, but in terms of a whole range of issues that come along with major infrastructure of this sort of caliber, I guess. So we're pretty alive to that, and we're really committed to working with those people and trying to solve as many of those issues as best we can. And if it's not us who can solve them, then working with other groups to make sure that we do.
Thanks, Mitch. We've got a question here, Mitch, while you've got your speaking hat on, from Matt McLaughlin. So they're wondering about whether we can reopen the comments on the interactive map so that there's that central point.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. That's a good question, and I think came up a couple of times in the in-person meetings that we had over the last couple of weeks. I think the point that I'd make is that we, with the narrower corridor, can obviously speak face-to-face to landholders who are within that area. And if we're talking about those really specific issues, then we'll be providing holding maps, physical maps, that landholders can mark up in a way that would allow for a whole lot more detail than would be available on the online map. We're also sort of working with a reference group that we've established for the project, which is made up of a number of residents from across the project area who can provide some of that feedback too. But we'll give some thought as well to how we can get feedback from anybody who doesn't want to speak to us directly. It might be the interactive map, but it is a little bit limited because there's only a certain amount of words that can be placed on a comment. Also pretty aware that it's not necessarily the best feedback channel for people who might have connectivity issues living across the area. So we'll think about that, but I think the best route for people within that corridor to provide feedback is to actually provide it directly to those landholder liaison officers who either have been in touch with them or are trying and are continuing to try to get in touch with people.
Thanks, Mitch. Mark, I've got a question to you about bushfire safety generally. There's been a question and a couple of questions pre-submitted as well about bushfire safety in relation to the transmission line.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. So the query around bushfire has been going around. We understand it's a major concern for people, and we're going to be doing a study during the ES as part of this. We're also going to be working closely with the CFA to be able to work with that, because at the end of the day, they're the people who really understand this and can work with us to understand that. And I think that's probably it for now, is that, you know, a real key here is that we want to work with the expert, the specialist, to make sure that's right and make sure it gets included as part of the ES process.
Thank you. Next question, Mitch, I might go back to you about, it's a question from Keith about the need for complete openness and transparency for the VNI West project, and particularly asking about the community reference group. So acknowledging that Keith says that the community feels that openness and transparency has been missing. So Keith is wondering if the CRG, Community Reference Group, will openly share its membership minutes and information with the community.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks, Keith, for that question. So yes, basically is the answer. We will share all of those things. We had the first meeting of that community reference group in mid-September. A lot of that meeting was actually getting the terms of reference down for what that group was and how it would work. Those will be published. I know that the membership of that committee was also posted on our website and emailed to subscribers to our project e-update, and I'll just get a plug in for people to subscribe to that while I've got you all here. If you're not already subscribed to that, you can do that via our website. So the membership has been published. We are still accepting applications from people who are across the project area. I think I'd hasten to add that the membership of that committee contains a number of people who've expressed some of that really strong opposition or reservation about the project, as I mentioned before. And I think that so far, particularly in that first meeting, I know it's only early days, but I think that they've shown a real commitment to making sure that they are a valuable resource for the community in getting answers from TCV on things that they think are unclear in the community, and making sure that that information is distributed to community members who need it, who have real and legitimate questions about what's going on with the project.
Okay. Thanks, Mitch. Question for you, Mark, from Brian. Where are the other potential renewable energy developments that have been taken into account? So it's particularly looking at slide 15 in your presentation.
Yep. So when we were going through the process initially, they were the publicly available planning approved projects. So there's a number of solar farms up in the Kerang area. There's a large wind farm in close to Stawell. Since that time, there has been a number of other things brought to our attention that we're currently looking at and working through. But at the time of doing the assessment, it was really looking at those, planning approved, publicly available renewable energy projects.
Thank you. Just going through the list here of questions that we haven't covered, but another one for you. Well, actually, Deepak, we'll throw to you a question from Barry. Is it too simplistic to say that the complicated economic assessment of the viability of the need for VNI West produced by Professor Bruce Mountain had a basic flaw in that it assumed Victoria could be self-sufficient in renewable energy zones, that the AEMO ISP renewable zones in other states along Eastern Australia were not necessary to link to Victoria? If correct, what is being done to help those who thought the Mountain report changed the need for VNI West?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. So this is related to Plan B. So I think this question is very specific to the modelling, so which is kind of AEMO Victoria Planning and does the modelling from the of the interconnector. So I don't think I'm best placed to answer that question. So maybe Sam, or if someone who can actually take it from a modelling perspective, I can provide an update on where the Plan B is, but I definitely can't answer this modelling related question.
Yeah,
Thanks,
absolutely. So look, TCV has it's not TCV, sorry. AEMO undertook analysis of Plan B. They reviewed the recommendations of Plan B and the proposal that was put forward. There were some of the key objectives of VNI West, including a second interconnector to New South Wales to provide that diversity of supply and the security and reliability of supply into Victoria. And that is, not achieved by Plan B, and that's the lack of a second interconnector in New South Wales is acknowledged by the Plan B authors. So there was that and several other reasons why we didn't, after our thorough assessment of Plan B, feel it doesn't stack up. So look, TCV is progressing with VNI West on the basis. But then I'll speak to Deepak to speak to what Big Gov is doing in relation to further analysis of Plan B.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And yes, so we are, or the Victorian government has commissioned an independent report on the Plan B, and it's something that we plan to publish in due course. At this stage, looking to have that the draft published by end of this month. Again, from a Victorian government perspective, AEMO is the statutory Victorian planner for the transmission network, and they have responded back to the Plan B report, and we will provide feedback once we get the independent report available. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Deepak. Mitch, you wanted to add something to this?
Yeah, please. I think to the question that you were asking, Barry, around the need for interconnection and self-reliability and those sorts of things. I won't go into all of the specifics of the modelling, but I think one of the key elements of this project is actually that it allows for the Victorian market to access electricity interstate. We had a question earlier about, the availability of agricultural land and all those sorts of things. And one of the real benefits of interconnection in this case is that you don't necessarily need to have such a large build out of energy generation in a single spot if you can rely on generation that's somewhere else and export it through an interconnector such as is being proposed by VNI West. So I think one of the benefits that we really see in this is that it actually helps to alleviate some of that need for agricultural or other land to be required for whether it's wind farms, solar farms, whatever it might be, as Sam sort of outlined in that energy transition. Thanks.
Thanks, Mitch. And the last question we have time for, Sam, goes to you. It's from Gavin. Option 5A was determined by the directive of May 2023, Victorian Gov, never ministerial order. It's been challenged in the Supreme Court. What happens if the court rules that the order is quashed? You're on mute.
Sorry, thank you. It depends on the nature of the ruling they pronounce. I can't speak to what the court will decide, and it's too many possibilities for a court decision to really articulate it clearly. I just can't give an answer to that, I'm afraid. But if there is, that's pretty much what it is.
Thanks, Sam. So it's time for us to close this webinar, but I really would like to thank everyone for their time and for the many questions that have come through, and for giving up your early evening to hear more about the Victoria-New South Wales Interconnector project. We encourage people to get along. There will be many more events and opportunities, as well as the website, to engage with and find out answers to things. I'd like to apologise if we didn't get to your question today, but assure you that we will make sure that any outstanding questions will be addressed in the materials on the website, including adding new questions to the FAQ. So look out for that. The questions that were answered, the same thing will happen. They will be addressed so that you can refer back to the answers given in the FAQ. As I said at the beginning, the recording and presentation will be made available on the TCV website, so look out for that. But thank you all once again, and thanks to our panellists. That's it for the night. Thank you.